We now have a virtual presentation for you, so we're keeping our fingers crossed that all the technicals work out okay. It's another case study. We heard one earlier from Muntons. This one is from Michael Brown from Hydrogen East, who, all being well, will be on a screen near you very soon, we hope.
So hopefully my virtual clicker will work and you see the slides and move along. So yeah, Hydrogen East, who are we? So we actually only just set up in May 2020. Again, it's the primary role really was to get talking about some of the opportunities that could be seen across the east of England, looking at developing local supply chains and markets, and getting the conversation going a little bit more around hydrogen. We've been focused on a number of specific projects across the region, which I'll walk you through later today. But really what we want to see is uptake across a range of sectors, maybe some initial demonstration projects over the next few years, possibly across power, heat, buildings, transport, and businesses fundamentally as well. So just to set the background around this, so there's been a rapidly developing landscape, not just with hydrogen, but more broadly with the wider net zero debate over the past 18-24 months. So this slide really just sets out that timeline, how we've seen it across the hydrogen landscape. So looking back in the top left corner there, you can see the Clean Growth Strategy, which was published in 2017. And at that point, net zero was barely even a concept, and there was no debate really around increasing ambition. It was all about reducing to a certain level on 1990 levels. So, looking at where we are now, considering we've got net zero in law, we're seeing the ambition being increased to 2030 and through to 2050 as well. There's been a lot that's happened over these 18 months. And so this kind of sets out, and it helps to visualize the amount of publications and documents that we've received in that space. In particular, looking at some of the hydrogen stuff that's come out. So we've seen a lot of industry reports looking at the safety case, offshore integration, and also uptake in transport and heat and those kind of things. And we've also seen a flurry of government documents. So those documents that are bordered in red are what has come out from government in respect of hydrogen. So around the middle of the screen, I can't point, I don't think you won't see, but we had the 10-point plan come out at the end of last year. And point number 2 on there was hydrogen development, getting scale going across the country and seeing regional development there. We've also had a number of funding schemes announced, and largely in transport, but also the industrial clusters, and some around industrial fuel switching. And now we've had the heat and building strategy most recently, but most importantly in respect of hydrogen development, we had the UK hydrogen strategy published just last month. And within there's a lot of commitment as to what we might need to do in order to get hydrogen going in the UK. But also importantly, it set out a number of consultations that are going to be looked at over the coming months and years in respect of actually fleshing out what the opportunity looks like. So yeah, the hydrogen strategy itself, just a brief overview of what was in there. Really, it just reaffirms some of the commitments that were made in the 10-point plan. But most importantly, it's committed to 5 gigawatts of production capacity by 2030. I know from what we're hearing from industry, they think that could be made a little bit higher. The target could be 10, 15, 20 gigawatts potentially. And some regions, so looking at the Northeast and the Northwest, they're saying that they can meet that target by themselves. Also, it is set out that hydrogen could meet around 20 to 35% of final energy demand. So that's a huge chunk of the future energy mix. There was also 900 million of funding announced. So a lot of this has already been committed and it's historical, but there is some that's due to come out in the coming months and years, and we've set out some of that in the slides a bit further along. Most importantly, within there, they said that they were adopting a twin track approach to hydrogen production. So that's looking at both blue and green hydrogen production, and I'll talk about what that means later on. But it's moving away from a debate of, you know, it's either or. It's all types of hydrogen. As long as it's got low carbon content, it should be suitable and compatible with achieving net zero. But like I said previously, a lot of the decisions have been pushed through to 2022. So there's a number of consultations out at the moment. So thinking about blending into the gas grid, the future of the gas system itself, those kind of things, they're being looked at and potentially published at the end of this year and into 2022. So setting the context around hydrogen then. So why is hydrogen being seen as potentially a big thing of the future and potentially of the now? So we've seen that it's expected that hydrogen is going to play a big part. It looks like hydrogen is able to play a part in a number of sectors. So one of the advantages about hydrogen is that it is versatile. So you can use it across transport, across heat. You can use it in marine applications, heavy machinery and equipment, within the gas grid. So there's lots of uses for hydrogen. And I suppose one of the key benefits of it is that it's a green gas, and that's something that we don't have currently. And the benefits of that are that you can look at potential energy storage, coping with seasonal demand. So when you've got a lot of offshore wind generating in the winter months, rather than that being wasted or curtailed, you can use that energy, store it up, and use it whenever it might be needed. Also thinking as well about the benefit to the system, the general electricity system. So looking at flexibility values of potential hydrogen production. There's a range of applications that might make it potentially beneficial, and especially in the context of the east of England, where the electricity grid is quite constrained. And so looking at an alternative energy source might be quite beneficial. So moving on to specifically how hydrogen is produced. So you might have heard a number of colours banded about in respect of types of hydrogen. The primary method for producing hydrogen at the moment in the UK is grey hydrogen production. So that's typically produced through steam methane reformation of fossil fuels. And when the hydrogen is produced, there's also CO2 that's produced, and that's released into the atmosphere. And so that's not compatible with net zero. And so the solution for that type of hydrogen production is blue hydrogen, which looks at capturing that carbon that's produced in the same process. Now, the capture rates are uncertain. There's not really anything that's proven at large scale in respect of carbon capture and storage. And so blue hydrogen is still being developed. It's likely that that's going to be pursued in the industrial clusters, thinking about the northeast and the northwest. But crucially, we need to ensure that that carbon is captured if it's going to be compatible moving forward. Most interestingly, I suppose, is green hydrogen, which is the gold standard. So through electrolysis of water, you split the H2O molecule into pure hydrogen and pure oxygen. And that way there's no carbon dioxide that's produced in the process. You can use that pure hydrogen as a fuel, and potentially use that oxygen for other use cases as well. And the idea is that you would get the electricity for electrolysis from potentially an offshore wind farm or onshore wind farm or solar farm or whatever it might be. And there's some other colours I noted along the bottom. I think we're moving away from the colour debate in the UK. As I mentioned earlier, we're looking more at carbon content of hydrogen. And so we'll probably see hydrogen produced from nuclear and pyrolysis classed as low carbon hydrogen moving forwards. So yeah, looking at the range of applications. So we've touched on this already in part. So the fact that, so looking top left corner, the clean power generation. So you can electricity if you wanted to create power at times of need. Commercial buildings so often have large natural gas demand. You could use the green hydrogen gas to fuel some of the boilers there, and the same goes for homes and heat systems. And also looking more broadly at transport. So we'll probably see uptake in the heavier end of the market with transport. So thinking about those HGVs, construction vehicles, trains in particular areas where it's not viable to electrify. We think the passenger car market is probably going to be predominantly electric. So we're already seeing a lot of movement there in that respect. And the previous speaker mentioned about the potential with electric there. And also energy storage. I mentioned earlier on the value in using renewables in the summertime that would otherwise not be used, and storing that energy to be used in the winter months. So looking in a little bit more depth, so looking at transport specifically, so we think this is going to be one of the early movers, particularly in the east of England, given the barriers we have to, given it's a largely rural area, and there's barriers in terms of traveling long distances and having access to a charging network. You might see some of those heavier vehicles and those long distance transport applications uptake hydrogen. I suppose one of the advantages is that you would refuel as you would a normal petrol and diesel car today. So it's within 2 or 3 minutes. And the range that you get as a result of that could be 300, 400, 500 miles. So typical to what we see today. And so looking at that heavier end of the market, that's quite advantageous if you need something that's quick and that can take you those long distances. So the idea is that we would start to see a cross-country refueling network come into play. The cost savings will be obviously derived as a result of getting more vehicles converted to hydrogen and scaling up that network across the country. And there's funding, like I mentioned earlier on, around specific applications and demonstration projects for hydrogen vehicles across the country at the moment. And also we have the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, which sets out the options for hydrogen in that heavier vehicle end of the market moving forwards. And I think actually appended to the slides, if they're circulated afterwards, we've listed some of those funding opportunities and some of those schemes that are currently ongoing that you could look to potentially get involved in. Moving forward, so looking at the role in heat as well. So that's probably another big area that we may or may not see local businesses and local homeowners experience some kind of impact. So at the moment, like I said, it's unsure as to what extent hydrogen will play a part in decarbonising heat. There's a number of feasibility studies that are underway looking at whether it's safe, whether it's reliable, whether it can perform in a similar way to the way that natural gas does today. And the idea is if we look on the right-hand side of the screen here, looking at that hydrogen blending into the gas network. So currently today, the permitted levels of hydrogen blend into the gas grid is 0.1%, so very, very small. The idea is that the current gas grid could cope with blends of up to 20%, especially with the current upgrade works that are going on. And so the next step would be to allow blends up to 20% within the gas grid and start decarbonising heat that homes use. Obviously, that's only part of the way. That there's still 80% then that needs to be decarbonised, and that would be almost you wouldn't get gradual blending of 20, then 40, then 50%, for example. That's purely limited by the fact that the grid infrastructure at the moment, there's currently still a fair few steel pipelines. So I think we're around 65 to 70% complete in respect of upgrading those pipelines into polyethylene pipelines, which basically plastic pipes, which don't fracture when hydrogen flows through the material. Whereas with steel pipelines, given hydrogen is a very small molecule, it can cause steel embrittlement within the pipeline, which could cause leaks and cracks and those kind of things. So the gap between 20 and 100% is purely making sure that the infrastructure is in place to allow that, and also that it's safe and possible. So the government's announced its intention to support a hydrogen neighbourhood trial by 2023. I think we're seeing that's going to be in Gateshead up in the north, and potentially a larger scale by 2025, looking at a hydrogen village. And there's also mention as well now of a hydrogen town by 2030. So we'll wait to see what happens there. The government's working with HSE to get blends of 20% enabled by 2023, so actually quite soon. There's a number of studies that have been completed now, and we've kept track of all of those on our website. So if you wanted to go and have a look at what's been done and where we're at, I recommend going and having a look there. And I mentioned as well that there's a number of call for evidences out, and in 2022 the government's going to look at mandating hydrogen ready appliances. So right now, if you install a gas boiler, it's not necessarily able to take a hydrogen blend. It's a tiny cost to make sure that any future boiler that's being replaced through its natural process is a very tiny step and cost to actually make that boiler hydrogen ready for the future. So if we do see a hydrogen gas grid moving forwards, you would be well placed as a homeowner and as a business to take a hydrogen that comes through the grid for heating and whatever it might be. And there's that consultation that's launching later this year, looking at what role the gas grid is expected to play and what areas it might touch specifically. So taking it then and looking at Norfolk and Suffolk. So a lot of this is national hype and national hope, but what is it that is special about Norfolk and Suffolk, and what is it about Norfolk and Suffolk that might be different to other regions, and where might we start to see early uptake and across what sectors? So we know that the east of England is already an energy powerhouse. So we have lots of offshore wind and lots more coming online in the future. We've also got the Bacton gas terminal, which brings around 20 to 30% of UK gas through onshore. We've also got new nuclear coming in at Suffolk and potentially Essex. And so there's clear potential here for blue, green, whatever colour of hydrogen you might want to be produced in the future. So in theory, the east of England looks well placed to go about producing hydrogen. The issue comes more with where you might send that hydrogen. So where does the demand come from? Obviously, if we enable 20% blends within the gas grid, that's a start, and that gives potential offtake. But what we don't see in the east of England, which we do see in industrial clusters up in the northeast or the northwest, is a large industrial load. So we have energy intensive operations across the region in quite a dispersed distribution, but we don't have that central point where we can channel hydrogen demand. And so that's why we haven't necessarily seen development here as we have seen in other regions across the UK. And so the way we see it developing is this approach to this bottom-up approach to demand aggregation. So looking at where there might be a cluster of fleets or a cluster of hydrogen applications that might enable you to create a hydrogen demand anchor to warrant creating a hydrogen supply in the future. And so some of the potential sources of demand across Suffolk, so we probably see a role for a few demo projects with local authority waste wagons, so often heavy vehicles going out for long durations, and also for wider road transport. So looking at some of the the large buses across the region, especially in Norfolk. There's quite an old aging fleet of buses, and it might be a good opportunity to trial some hydrogen buses there, and also some of the HGVs that travel those long distances, so travel across the country and over to Europe through the ports along the East Coast. There's also in the east of England this use case that isn't spoken about too much, but looking at agriculture, and agricultural processes require large, heavy machinery that is still burning diesel, and so looking at potentially applying hydrogen in that particular use case could be something that's quite niche about this region and something that isn't being explored elsewhere, and potentially something that can make a huge dent in overall emissions. And also in construction of big projects. So Sizewell C is listed there as an example, but reducing that embedded carbon in developments and actually having hydrogen forklifts, hydrogen waste wagons or whatever it might be, and actually reducing the emissions of whatever the new development might be. Looking as well over at potentially decarbonising trains, so looking at hydrogen trains. We're in quite a unique position in the east of England in that Network Rail has flagged some of the East Coast lines for hydrogen conversion, and looking at batteries aren't necessarily suitable to travel the long distances that are required, and electrification isn't necessarily financially viable. And so Network Rail is looking at potentially converting some of those lines along the East Coast to hydrogen. Decarbonising some of the energy intensive processes, so looking at sugar beet processing, or even breweries which have large gas demand and are often carbon point sources across the region. Blending into some of the region's combined cycle gas turbine plants, so looking at where you might be able to, a good example is the Great Yarmouth CCGT, which actually can take a 50% blend of hydrogen today, and that would significantly slash the emissions and the amount of carbon that's emitted through that process. And also looking at ports. Ports are actually quite interesting given that there's a congregation of different demands at ports. So you have things like the marine vessels, you have rail networks which pass through the ports and between ports. You've obviously got all the heavy goods vehicles that pass through from Europe and across to the Midlands and down to the southwest, and also some of that port side equipment as well, looking at forklifts and similar machinery, looking at how you might use hydrogen for those applications as well. And also fundamentally heating homes and heating businesses across the region, looking at where hydrogen might be able to play a part there. I've got a little timer on my screen which says I've got 7 minutes left, so I'll try and speed through the last few slides. This really is just a demonstration of how we might look to aggregate demand, and we've developed a mapping portal which is helping us to do this. So looking at some of the physical networks here. So this is the major road network across the region. Also popping on here the railways, so we can see the split of electric versus diesel railway lines. And those ones that travel north to south down to London typically tend to be electrified. Those ones that are traveling east to west are those that tend to be diesel powered locomotives. And it's those lines, so the line that goes up to Cromer and those lines along the East Suffolk coast that have been flagged by Network Rail for hydrogen conversion. We've been looking specifically at using historic landfill sites, which are currently in many cases wastelands which can't be developed upon. We're looking at the potential to actually site solar PV on those in those areas alongside an electrolyzer to produce hydrogen, which could be used for local transport fleets. So if I pop on here, looking at some of the licensed landfill sites, so we know that there's regular visits and present day visits from some of the waste wagons that are attending those sites. There's a potential demand there. Similarly for recycling centres, which have a number of large vehicles going to and from. Interestingly as well, wastewater treatment plants. So not only is there a large energy demand as part of the processes there's also fleets going to and from, which could potentially be hydrogen powered. But interestingly as well, in the wastewater treatment process, oxygen, pure oxygen, is a key part that's required. And so in producing green hydrogen, you could make a case for using both the pure hydrogen that's produced, but also the pure oxygen. And you can probably think of a number of other use cases for that oxygen as well, thinking about hospitals, potentially even scuba diving and similar things across along the coast. So our approach really is thinking about how you might congregate some of these demands to anchor that initial hydrogen supply. And also looking at some of the existing generators across the region. So we know in parts of Norfolk and especially Suffolk, renewable generators can be paid to turn off due to grid constraints and sometimes curtailment. So times that generators aren't producing energy or are producing energy but can't export it, that can be more than 20% of their operation time in a year. So it's a huge amount of energy that's wasted that you could look at potentially using to produce hydrogen in times that the energy can't be exported to the grid to use for some of these wider demand cases across the region. So Lowestoft Power Park is an example of how we've used some of this mapping work. I'm conscious of time, so I won't speak too much about this, but basically there's many of you will know the Gulliver onshore wind turbine at the power park site. That's coming to a point where it either needs to be repowered or redeveloped. And so using that redeveloped turbine to potentially produce hydrogen to fuel some of the local demands is something that we've been looking at. So if I move on to the next slide, we've zoomed in and looked at a potential use cases across the immediate region. So looking at the first bus depot, which is immediately next door in the top right of that map, looking at some of East Suffolk Council's fleets, but also Suffolk County Council's fleets as well. Some of that non-road mobile machinery, so around the port, there's a fair bit of that. You could look at potentially using hydrogen there. Some of the crew transfer vessels, so those that are maintaining offshore wind farms, also some of those larger service vessels that could also be hydrogen powered. And also some of that haulage. So you've got the A47 there that's passing by. You could potentially see, or you do see a large number of HGVs pass from the port and through over to the Midlands and down to London. So you could look at refueling infrastructure that would help to decarbonise that entire network. And also there's a rail siding there that we've highlighted in yellow that is potentially something that could site solar and potentially site an electrolyzer to produce hydrogen and refuel some of these applications. And also the Wherry line, I should mention, is one of those lines that's been flagged by Network Rail for hydrogen conversion. I did have an example here for Suffolk as well. So we've looked at where some of those energy intensive users are in Bury St Edmunds as an example. So we've got the Anglia Water large wastewater treatment plant just north of Bury St Edmunds. And we also have sugar beet processing, which is a high gas user currently purely through the process of drying out the sugar beet. And also the brewery there as well, which is also a large gas demand. We know that within the region, there's more than 100 medium and large fleet vehicles. And we know that along that stretch of road, so you can see based on the color coding, the darker red the shade, the more heavy goods vehicles there are that pass through. You can see that there's around 6,000 to 8,000 HGVs passing through there each day along that stretch of the A14, coming from the ports and over to the Midlands. So potentially a good point to put some refueling infrastructure. We know also the immediate areas are surrounded by farmland. So again, there's that agricultural option for using the hydrogen. And we know as well, Gateway 14 is part of the Freeport East bid. So with Felixstowe and Harwich, you might see maybe hydrogen production over at Gateway 14, refueling some of the HGVs and vehicles that pass through, but also some applications for refueling vessels and that kind of thing as well. So This is a very niche example, but clearly a good example of how you might start to aggregate that demand across the region. Now, I'm very conscious of time, so just to flash up this briefly, this is our network vision for the East. So this is how we see it playing out, looking at some of the generation assets, but some of the demand offtakes across the region also. And in respect of next steps, so we're currently looking at potentially developing a new Anglia hydrogen strategy. So working with the LEP and some of the local councils and some of those key regional stakeholders, looking at what we should be doing from the perspective of the East to actually get the East of England on the map or on the hydrogen map and get things moving here. We've got a number of projects that are underway. So we're looking at the Lowestoft Power Park, Snetterton Clean Transport Hub. That's a historical landfill site that might be able to host renewables and produce hydrogen on a strategic part of the A11. The Freeport East stuff that we just mentioned, but also the Baxton Energy Hub. There's some ongoing work streams there looking at how hydrogen might be produced and sent through the gas distribution system. We've launched we're going to launch the net zero mapping tool, which is a way of visualizing these opportunities across the East and looking at how we might aggregate those demands. And on the far right, I suppose the ultimate thing that we want to be doing here is getting projects on the ground. So what can we do to place the East of England well for future funding rounds, specifically the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund, which is launching next year. And so how can we make sure that the East of England is ready to go in terms of putting a pitch in for something like that? So that's everything I had to go through. I'm not sure how we've done for time, but potentially we can take questions now, or we can go on to the panel session.
You've covered that really well indeed, and we'll have some questions for you, I'm sure, in a few moments, because as you rightly say, you're part of the panel we have assembling very soon on the stage here. Thank you very much indeed. Just in case you're wondering if we're still with you, we'll give you all a big round of applause. Fantastic.